For nearly 1,000 years, the known world lived under a single certainty. Rome was eternal. Its legions were the most perfect war machine humanity had ever seen. They marched from the sands of Syria to the forests of Britain, crushing kings, conquering nations, and redrawing the map of the world at the point of a sword. A Roman citizen walked the earth with the arrogance of someone who knew that behind him there stood a power no one dared to challenge. The Pax Romana was not merely a period of peace, it was an imposition. But history is cruel to empires that believe themselves immortal. Everything would change in a single afternoon. The exact date, August 9th, 378 AD. The place, an arid, dusty plain near the city of Adrianople in what is now Turkey. In a span of just 3 hours, the time it takes to watch a long movie or a soccer match, the myth of Roman invincibility was torn apart, piece by piece. 20,000 of the empire's finest soldiers, the elite of the Eastern legions, were slaughtered so thoroughly that the ground became a swamp of blood and mud. And at the center of this chaos, the most powerful figure in the world, Emperor Valens, would vanish from the face of the earth, leaving behind only ashes and mystery. This is not merely the story of a lost battle. It is the story of how the pride of a single man, blinded by envy and arrogance, opened the gates of hell for the West. Today, we are going to dissect the disaster of Adrianople. To understand the massacre, we need to look east, to the deep steppes of Asia. Something terrifying was happening there. The ancient world was on the move. The Huns, a warrior people who seemed forged in the very nightmare of civilized nations, began migrating westward. They were not just an army. They were a force of nature, a human avalanche that destroyed everything it touched. Faced with this terror, the Germanic tribes inhabiting Eastern Europe fell into absolute panic. Among these tribes were the Goths, specifically the Tervingi clan, led by a shrewd and pragmatic chieftain named Fritigern. Fritigern looked back and saw death galloping toward him with the Huns. He looked ahead and saw the only thing that could save them, the Danube River. The Danube was not just a river. It was the scar that divided the barbarian world from Roman civilization. It was a militarized, patrolled, and secure frontier. Fritigern did the unthinkable. He did not try to invade. He begged. He sent envoys to Emperor Valens, the Augustus of the East, asking for asylum. "Let us in," they said. "Let us cross the river. In return, we will live peacefully in your lands and serve in your armies." From his palace in Antioch, Emperor Valens saw this not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a gift from the gods. Rome was always in need of labor and fresh blood. Think about Valens' logic. Hundreds of thousands of strong warriors, ready to fight for Rome without him having to conscript his own peasants, thus keeping the agricultural economy running. It seemed like the deal of the century. Gold in human form. Valens authorized the crossing. And so the Danube filled with boats, rafts, and floating logs. Men, women, children, the elderly, wagons creaking under the weight of all the possessions of a lifetime. They crossed the waters seeking the Pax Romana. They sought order, they sought civilization, but what they found was Rome at its ugliest. The management of that mass of refugees was handed to two Roman officials, Lupicinus and Maximus. If history had cartoon villains, these two would be them. But their cruelty was very real and very human. Instead of organizing the supplies the emperor had promised, Lupicinus and Maximus saw those desperate families as an opportunity for quick profit. They diverted the food. They blocked the resources. The Gothic refugee camps became hells of hunger and disease. And it was there that Roman brutality reached its peak. The officials began selling food to the Goths, but it was not normal food. Contemporary accounts say they sold dog meat and the flesh of animals that had died from disease. And the price? The price was the soul. When the Goths' gold ran out, Lupicinus and Maximus made an offer that still turns the stomach today. "Give us your children, and we will give you meat." Gothic fathers and mothers, watching their families die of starvation, were forced to hand over their young children to Roman officials. These children were enslaved and sold into the empire's human trafficking networks. Imagine the hatred growing in the hearts of those people. You flee a mortal enemy, cross a sacred frontier, swear loyalty to an emperor, and in return, that empire starves your family and steals your children into slavery. The Romans were no longer dealing with refugees. They were creating, within their own borders, an army fueled by the most volatile substance that exists: pure hatred. Rebellion was inevitable. When it erupted, it was not a riot. It was a war of extermination. The Goths took up arms, many of them smuggled in or taken from dead guards, and began burning the region of Thrace. News of the chaos reached Valens. The emperor was furious. How dare those barbarians bite the hand that, theoretically, fed them? Valens assembled the Eastern Field Army and marched toward Europe. But here enters the human factor, the flaw of character that would condemn thousands to death: envy. Valens was not the only emperor. The empire was divided. In the west ruled his young nephew, Gratian. Gratian was everything Valens was not: young, charismatic, energetic, and worst of all, a recent war hero. While Valens dealt with bureaucratic problems in the east, young Gratian was in Gaul, winning decisive battles against the Alemanni. The people loved him. The soldiers sang his name. Valens, a middle-aged man, tired of living in the shadow of more illustrious relatives, tasted the bitter flavor of jealousy. Gratian sent messengers. "Uncle, I am on my way. I am bringing the Western legions. Wait for me. Together, with our combined forces, we will crush the Goths with no chance of defeat." It was the obvious strategy. It was the safe strategy. It was the intelligent strategy. But then Valens' scouts returned with a report. They had spotted Fritigern's column and estimated the Gothic army at only 10,000 men. Valens' mind worked quickly. He had about 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers under his command. If he waited for Gratian, the victory would be shared. His young nephew would once again take half the glory. But if Valens attacked now, if he crushed those mere 10,000 barbarians on his own, the glory would be entirely his. He would finally be Rome's hero. His most experienced generals, such as Count Ricomeris, begged him, "Wait for Gratian. Do not risk it." But pride is deaf. Valens looked at the flawed report, looked at his envy, and gave the order to march. He did not know it, but he was walking toward a slaughterhouse. The morning of August 9th dawned hot, and it only got worse. It was the height of summer in the eastern Mediterranean. The Roman legions were ordered to march quickly to intercept the Goths. They marched nearly 13 kilometers over rough terrain. Imagine the scene: thousands of men marching under a 40-degree sun, wearing heavy chainmail, carrying shields, scutum, spears, pilum, supplies, and metal helmets that cooked their heads. They had not had time for breakfast. They did not have enough water. Dehydration began to take its toll before they even saw the enemy. When they finally reached the plain where the Goths were camped, the Romans encountered an infernal sight. Fritigern, cunning as a fox, had ordered his men to set fire to the dry wheat fields and surrounding vegetation. The wind blew the hot, dense smoke directly into the faces of the Roman legions. The air became unbreathable. Soot covered their eyes, filled their dry throats. The Roman soldiers were already exhausted, hungry, thirsty, and half-blinded by smoke. Before them, the Goths had formed a lager, a defensive circle made from their massive wagons. Inside that circle were the women and families, shouting encouragement. Outside it, the Gothic infantry waited. Fritigern tried to negotiate one last time, perhaps to buy time, perhaps to avoid the massacre. But Roman discipline, worn down by heat and fury, collapsed. Without direct orders, 2 units of Roman light cavalry, the Scutarii, lost patience and launched a premature, disorganized attack. They were easily repelled. Combat began chaotically. The Roman infantry lines advanced, colliding with the Gothic shield wall. For a moment, it seemed the Roman machine would work. Despite the heat, despite the smoke, Roman heavy infantry was the best in the world. They began to push the Goths back, bending their lines, forcing them against the wagons. Valens, watching from the rear, must have smiled. Victory seemed close, but the scouts' report was wrong, fatally wrong. The 10,000 men the scouts had seen were only the infantry. The Gothic heavy cavalry, the Groithungi and the Alans, were not there at the start of the day. They were far away, grazing their horses and searching for food. But Fritigern had sent messengers, and now they were returning. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived through this nightmare and survived to write about it, described the moment with terrifying poetry. They came down from the hills like a sudden lightning bolt shot from a storm. Thousands of horsemen, heavy cavalry, long lances. They emerged from the smoke and dust on the Roman right flank. The impact was devastating. The Roman cavalry, which should have protected the flanks, was wiped out in moments, fleeing in panic. Suddenly, the Roman infantry, focused on fighting forward, found itself surrounded. Gothic cavalry closed in from behind and from the sides. The Romans were trapped. What followed was a horrific physical phenomenon known as mass compression. The Goths pushed the edges of the Roman army inward. Roman ranks were crushed against one another. It became so tight, so dense, that soldiers in the middle of the formation could no longer lift their arms to use their swords. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, suffocated by the smell of sweat, blood, and smoke. They became static targets. The Goths hurled spears and arrows into the compact mass. There was no need to aim. Any projectile that fell there would strike human flesh. Ammianus reports that the ground became slippery with blood. Men stumbled and fell, but never rose again, trampled to death by the spiked boots of their own comrades struggling to remain upright. The heat was so intense that soldiers died of heat stroke in the midst of battle. Their bodies kept standing only by the pressure of the crowd around them. The noise was deafening. The clash of metal, screams of pain, the neighing of horses, and the roar of fire. The elite of the Eastern Army was being ground to pieces. The battle lasted until nightfall, when the moon rose over Thrace. 20,000 Romans lay dead. 2/3 of the army, 35 tribunes, high-ranking officers, were dead. Veteran generals, experienced commanders. The entire leadership structure of the Eastern military was erased in a single afternoon. And Valens? Where was the man whose vanity caused all of this? No one knows for certain. The emperor's body was never found for a proper burial, which in itself was a religious and political catastrophe for Rome. There are two final stories about him. The first, simpler one, says he was struck in the face by a stray arrow, falling among the mass of common soldiers, dying anonymously, trampled in the mud, indistinguishable from the men he had led to their deaths. The second story, told in dark rumors, is more Gothic and terrifying. It is said that Valens was wounded and that his bodyguards, the last loyal ones, managed to carry him off the battlefield, taking him to a small fortified farmhouse nearby. They tried to treat his wounds on the second floor, but the Goths, pursuing the survivors, surrounded the house. They did not know the Emperor of Rome was inside. They only saw Roman soldiers defending the door. Frustrated by the resistance, the Goths piled straw and dry wood around the house and set it on fire. Legend says that Valens, the man who ruled half the world, died screaming, burned alive, trapped in a peasant's hut, reduced to ashes while his empire burned outside. The sun rose on August 10th over a different world. Adrianople was not the end of the Roman Empire. It would survive in the east for another 1,000 years as Byzantium. But it was the end of the empire as it existed in the collective imagination. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The barbarians looked at the legions and realized they bleed, they die, and we can defeat them. The new emperor, Theodosius, inherited a disaster. With no army left to fight, he was forced to do something unprecedented. He signed a humiliating peace. The Goths were not expelled, they were granted land. They became foederati, a state within the state, living inside Rome's borders, armed with their own laws and kings. It was the beginning of the end. These same Goths, the Visigoths, would continue to be a thorn in Rome's throat. Just 32 years later, in 410 AD, under the leadership of Alaric, these men would march south and do the unthinkable. They would sack the city of Rome. The fall of Rome did not begin when the gates of the Eternal City were breached in 410. It began on that hot, smoke-filled afternoon of 378, when the greed of two officials and the envy of one emperor turned desperate refugees into the conquerors of the ancient world. And that is the brutal lesson of Adrianople. Empires are rarely murdered by external enemies. Most of the time, they commit suicide. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Roman military history, do not forget to leave a like. It helps the channel grow a great deal. Subscribe so you do not miss the next documentaries. Keep the standard high. Until next time, Legionaries.